Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast. Today, we have a returning guest, Peter Grandich of the Grandich Letter and author of Confessions of a Wall Street Whiz Kid. Peter, thanks for coming back.
Thank you for having me.
All right, first I want to get into is the government shutdown. Right now, I've never seen in my lifetime, a politically motivated shutdown like I did here. You see all sorts of posturing, and you have people throwing in threats of default. Do you see any type of default as a possibility? I personally think this is all trying to gain political position.
Well, you're right. You answered your own question in that the chances of an actual default are nil. There's been political posturing through all the debt ceiling crisis, but nothing compared to the level that we've seen here. And ironically, while both parties have made a decision that they would use this crisis to better their own parties by hurting the other, they've actually ended up hurting both themselves and have opened the door now for a clear third party or splinter groups to have more influence in the political process in the U.S. I think this action is the straw that broke the camel's back to Americans accepting the two-party system. And I particularly feel that because of what we're seeing actions by people outside the United States who normally don't comment on these matters have been very vocal. China has spoken up greatly about this mess. Several trade organizations around the world have spoken up, and also some sovereign countries and central bankers. And I think that will not bode well for the United States on the international front and will only help serve the dismantling of the two-party system in the U.S.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I've never remembered during a shutdown where things like the IMF and China have completely intervened or have made messages directly to the U.S. about getting their act together. So I think it's also showing that the U.S. is losing respect in the world's political realm.
They're not only losing it, they've lost it. That goes into a whole other problems from the Middle East and what have you, and why things have occurred that wouldn't have occurred 10 or 20 years ago, because the United States has lost its international prowess, and in my opinion, its true superpower status. And this all just plays into what's transpiring now on this latest crisis from Washington.
Yeah. And I actually want to get into switch from the government shutdown into today's most recent news is Janet Yellen has now been appointed the new Fed chairman of the Federal Reserve. Of course, there's a process that they have to go through, but I think this is a nomination done, that's in the bag. Would you agree with my statement that this means more of the same?
Oh, there's no question it's more of the same. In fact, I believe there was a trial balloon a couple of months ago that was clearly shot down. And, if you think about it, even when the Fed itself talked about tapering to what Wall Street actually bought into, a belief it would actually occur, something I believe would not occur. And if it did, it would only be a false act because the economy would fall sharply and they would have to go back into some sort of easing. But nevertheless, even the mere talk of a more hawkish type of person at the Fed and or tapering caused the long bond to go from 1.7 to 3%, the stock market to get hit, and people grow concern all around the world. So I believe the view was that she delivers more of the same. The Fed has clearly painted itself into a corner, and any thought or any reality that the Fed could tighten in the means of so-called tightening, of dramatically raising interest rates, has been shown it would be a death blow, particularly since now that the economy is only getting weaker, not stronger. It never really recovered in true economic fashion to begin with. And so not only will she get through, but her actions will be almost identical to what has been taking place the last several years, because they don't have a plan B, because there is no ability to implement plan B.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think one of the reasons Bernanke could have been talking about tapering was to stress test the markets to see what could have happened. And do you think it also could have been that Larry Summers, one of the reasons he resigned is maybe he was told that they can't taper, they can't stop this, and so he resigned. So I think the tapering was a stress test to see what would happen, and also to see that could Larry Summers come in.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yes.
Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, that was the trial balloon, and like I said, it blew up, and clearly any change in course would be detrimental, and that's why any chance of I believe he was actually considered by Obama as the lead candidate, but it was clearly told to them that if you did this, it could, it would be a nightmare, and that's why, he backed out, and she will be appointed without any problem as the new Fed chairperson.
Yeah, and one thing I noticed about her was that she was a speechwriter for, I believe it was Richard Nixon. And I think that's very compelling because it shows that the central bank has become more and more, the Federal Reserve Chairman has become more and more of a politician. And to lead to your point, the more of the same, it definitely looks like it, because it seems to me they don't want the speculative money going into hard assets. But if they were open and transparent about this policy and didn't talk about a recovery and didn't talk about tapering, all the money would rush in there. So their game plan is, yes, we're going to continue to ease, but we have to lie about it and continue a recovery. Does that seem like their game plan to you?
Well, I think there was some serious disagreement and still is in the Fed. That's why, if you recall, a couple of months ago, the markets were volatile because one day there was talk of the tapering, and the next another Fed person came out and said, no, we're not. I believe there was some serious disagreement, but I believe the winners that came out were those who still believe we must continue to do it because they were shown that even talk about it hurt the markets and the economy would slip. And one thing the Fed clearly recognized, that there was no real fiscal movement for years now in Washington towards helping things get better, and that there's only so much they can do. But to reverse course on their end without any real movement in Washington, and obviously we're seeing through this default talk that no one wants to work together there, it would have been foolish for them to change course, and that's why I think they'll stay on the same course.
Yeah, and I actually want to switch topics into the stock market. You heard about tapering, and we saw what it did. It went from its all-time highs, and now it's roughly in the 1400s, low 1500 range. Where do you see the stock market going from here? Do you think it can still rise for another 2 years with this with Janet Yellen continue tapering?
I've been around this just about 30 years, and for 20-something of it, I have concluded that there's a group that I have coined the Don't Worry, Be Happy crowd that influence and basically control Wall Street. And the spin will always be to make the cup half full. And my belief is, barring an absolute default, something that would shock, I think, all of us, that once whatever they come out in the agreement and it's been concluded and it's clear that she's going to be appointed, I believe that Don't Worry, Be Happy crowd will come back in and spin this as hard, as good as they can, that it's actually been beneficial, and that will allow the stock market to rally into year end from whatever point it reaches when this conclusion of the default is taken away. Do I think that is a rally that one wants to participate or can go so high and continue for much longer into 2014? No, I do not. But at least for the balance of the year, I believe the spin doctors will be out. I think eventually, despite everything, including an overwhelming Fed and almost a sure thing belief by a lot that as long as the Fed is easing, you can't lose money in the stock market, eventually the stock market does return to what it used to be 20, 30, 40, and 50 years ago, and that was a place where you can buy and sell part ownerships of businesses, and businesses lived or died on the strength of the economy, and the economy is clearly weakening very strongly to the downside again, and I suspect will even look like a recession 6 months from now, and that's when the stock market, no matter how much the Fed is easing, no matter how much interest rates are low, people are going to conclude that it's very hard for companies to do any better, and whatever PE ratios are out there, they're going to have to come lower, not higher, and that's when we'll finally have a significant move in the stock market to the downside. But I don't think we do see that until at least perhaps late winter or early spring of next year.
Yeah, this actually to me is sort of playing out. I remember reading in the book When Money Dies and how they kept quote unquote easing. It's about Weimar Germany. And eventually, after a couple of QEs, like here, the market finally went up. And eventually, there was a mania. And what eventually happened was it got so soaked with cheap money that eventually it had to go down. And since they printed and soaked it with so much, no matter how much they printed, it just kept going down because they could no longer print enough money to make it rise in value. Do you see that sort of summary scenario playing out?
We'll see that thought play out when the dollar starts to really break hard to the downside, which I still don't think will be till at least the middle of next year. I think it's going to hold support in here, not rally a lot, but not break down a lot. But when we do get that perception, when it's finally recognized around the world that what took place in Europe a few years ago is now going to be taking hold here, then we'll see that. And like you're saying, no matter how much easing there is, the stock market will go down but not up. But I still think we're several months away before anything like that can truly take hold.
All right, and I want to switch subjects to the last subject. You're relatively known for this is the gold market. Recently, the CFTC, I'll get to that later. Basically, from what we were just talking about in the stock market, this seems to be very bullish for gold.
Well, I'll give you my gold opinion. My opinion in that about 2 years ago when gold was approaching 2,000 an ounce, powers that be recognized that it was returning back to be a true barometer, and that any recognition by the group at large that that was the case could really put an end to the financial asset game. And I think, ironically, an event that should have driven gold much higher really became the watershed effect for manipulators to take hold and try real hard to push it down. And that was when the Germans showed up, knocked on the Fed's door one day and said, hey, you've been keeping our gold for quite a while. We'd like to have it back. Not only were they denied it, they were even denied the opportunity to see their supposed gold. And then without ever actually seeing it other than a very small room, it was agreed that 20% of what they had here would be sent to them over the next 7 years. Now, if people would just stop and understand just that scenario, they would run to their banks, take out all their money, and pack their bags and try to leave the country. But, of course, since the financial world controls what happens and in the media, and gold is the opposite, not only was that story not covered, but it was laughed at or tried to be laughed at as being silly. But if we would really understand that, it really should have caused a significant crisis. But it really turned out to be a watershed event in that groups and people started to sell gold at the worst possible time, in the worst possible fashion, that no legitimate seller who was truly just seeking to sell something because for whatever reason they had to raise money and all would ever take the methods and the timing that they used. And it created a serious decline in the paper market. And that in itself was significant because despite the paper price of gold declining a lot, the physical price of gold remained substantially higher than whatever the paper price was at that time because people were using such a decline around the world to buy more versus get out of whatever they could get out of, which the paper market had hoped they would do. Now, the question has become, and you brought up the CFTC scenario, the question has become, would the manipulators ever be shown for what they were? And I personally, and this is something I've expressed to my readers and friends and in my other business to people in recent days, that I believe this ruling in the CFTC after a 5-year investigation, they never said they didn't find anything. They said they couldn't find anything that they could prosecute. was really an open door to the manipulators to have a feeling, in a sense, that there's going to be no regulatory action to what they're doing. And as you and I speak and record this here on late Wednesday morning, I believe we see it again in the gold market. An announcement of what we've seen, the continuing crisis, really should not send gold $25 down, but sure enough, when the COMEX, or what I like to call the CRIMEX, opens up, where the paper market has its most influence, down she goes. So the gold market is currently not a reasonable market. And I'll just say one other thing before I forget, because I wouldn't want this interview to end and I didn't say it. To all those who would then say, oh, you guys are just tinfoil hat guys, and cry about manipulation. Oh, there is no manipulation in the gold market. The other question I would put to you, besides being concerned about Germany showing up and not being able to get its gold, is this. If there's manipulation in every other market, just Google. You'll see every other conceivable market out there now just has numerous charges, actions, and brought against, and people pleading guilty of manipulating all sorts of markets, whether it's soybeans and oil and foreign currencies and the LIBOR rate and all. To think foolishly that somehow at the door of the COMEX that manipulation stops is as foolish as to believe that the Americans have all the Germans' gold and they're only returning 20% over 7 years because somehow that helps everything. That is the most foolhardy news. The bad news in all of that is no one really cares, because the whole pyramid scheme of the financial world depends on gold never being able to be shown as a true barometer. So there's never going to be any real coverage of this and really sustained reporting to show America how bad this is really happening. And I really feel bad for people like Gatter, a small group who's been energetic and really fighting with their hands tied behind their back to demonstrate this to not only the investment community but to the financial media, but very few people in the investment media and clearly in the financial media care about it.
Yeah, I definitely, I hats off to GATA for doing this for such a long time. We've featured them on our channel. So they are starting to get some traction with the alternative media. And I'll do one last question, speaking of GATA and all this. A lot of these manipulation stories you hear on the alternative media, but you won't hear on the mainstream press except for LIBOR or anything. Do you see a rise in the alternative media in the future?
One would hope so, and I do think it's useful, but I don't think the typical American, particularly those that aren't active in the market, spend much time on that, and so they still depend on the left-wing media that dominates America's media reporting. But it certainly has opened the door for those who are willing to do a little work and to find it. But I don't think anytime soon we're going to see the masses depending on it.
All right. So, and I just want to conclude, I just want to thank you for coming back on, just for our viewers, to let you know what